Hey guys, today we're going to do another comparison video, but this time we're going to cover standard and wide body shaped paddles. The paddles we'll be looking at today are the Spartus Apollo, the Volair Mach 2 Forza, the Sword and Shield J3, the Sword and Shield J3K, the Sword and Shield J3K Pro, the GRUVN Movin 16S, the Ronbus R2 Pulsar Fx, the Pickln Piknix Pro, the A11N C8 Zenith, and finally, the 11624 Monarch All Court. Now the paddles I've included are 16mm Gen 2 thermoformed ones who have lengths that are 16 inches and below and widths that are at least 7.5 inches wide. They're going to come in various sizes and shapes, so this time we will take a look at metrics like swing weight and twist weight more than we did in the previous hybrid comparison video. You might be wondering why I've left off two popular paddles on this list, the Carbon 2X and the Yola Scorpius. I found both of those to be really similar to the Piknix Pro and Sword and Shield J3 respectively, and the latter two are also significantly cheaper, so just know that when I talk about the Piknix Pro and the J3, the same opinions apply to the 2X and the Scorpius. Starting off, let's take a look at the rankings for swing weights. For those of you unfamiliar, a higher swing weight will equate to the paddle being a bit slower to swing, while a lower number means the paddle will feel more maneuverable. At the top of the list with the highest swing weights are the more square-shaped and flat-top paddles. At number 1, we have the J3K Pro at 115, followed very closely by the R2 Pulsar Fx and J3K at 114. These are quite high numbers for swing weights on standard-shaped paddles and are similar to some hybrid-shaped paddles on the market, meaning these paddles are less maneuverable relative to their shape. Next up on the list is the J3 and the Piknix Pro at 112. These are also flat top paddles, but they're in a more manageable swing weight that's more similar to other standard shapes. Now the curved top paddles are all going to be a bit lower in swing weight because they're all under 16 inches in length, and the curve at the top of the paddle does make them quicker to swing. We have the Monarch All Court at 109, and then the Spartus Apollo tied with the Mach 2 Forza at 108. Now the next paddle is a bit of an outlier with the C8 Zenith at 106. Although it is a flat top paddle, it's a bit lower in length at 15.75 inches, making it a bit quicker compared to the other ones. Finally, the last spot goes to the Movin 16S at 104, which is the quickest paddle on this list. Out of all the paddles here, the 16S is the shortest in length, and it's also much more rounded in its shape at the corners, leading it to have the less paddle surface area overall, which leads to faster speed. I've put the rankings here on the screen, so feel free to pause now if you wanted to take a deeper look at them. Next, we'll take a look at their twist weight measurements. One thing to mention is that twist weight does not directly correlate with the sweet spot of a paddle. While there usually is a correlation, twist weight really only measures the stability on the horizontal axis, but there are other factors that go into the sweet spot, such as the overall reach of the paddle and the weight distribution. So while the twist weight can help in determining the sweet spot, it's not always a direct correlation. And for different players, there are different areas that you would classify as your primary hitting spots, and this can skew your perspectives on sweet spots. Anyways, at the top of the list for twist weight, we have the Spartus Apollo at 7.65. Standard shaped paddles generally have the higher twist weight measurements, and for me, the Apollo is the highest I've tested in a paddle. It has a slight flare at the top two corners, and while it has a 5.5 inch handle, the taper at the throat of the paddle is wider than all the other ones, giving it more weight distribution down there to increase the stability. The next paddle on this list is the Piknix Pro at 7.54. It's actually the paddle with the shortest handle on the list at 4.75 inches, which allows it to have more paddle surface area and a more stable feel. Next, we have the Volair Mach 2 Forza at 7.23, and then the Monarch All Court at 7.21, which is quite different in the rankings for swing weights. Following those is the J3K with 7.10, and then the Movin 16S at 7.06. While the Movin is the shortest paddle on the list, its lower paddle surface area overall does lower the twist weight a bit, which is why the ranking for it is roughly in the middle of the list. Moving on are the rest of the flat top shaped paddles, with the J3K Pro at 7.05, the R2 Fx at 7.00, the J3 at 6.99, and finally the C8 Zenith at 6.76. In general, the curved top paddles tend to score a bit higher here, mainly because they are a bit shorter in length and wider compared to their flat top counterparts. Shorter and wider paddles tend to have higher twist weights, which makes sense here. The only real outliers here are the Piknix Pro, Movin 16S, and the C8 Zenith. The Piknix has a high twist weight from its shorter handle and larger paddle surface area. The 16S is the opposite, with it having a short length but overall less paddle surface area, and although the C8 Zenith is 15.75 inches, it's not wider than any of the other flat top paddles, and it's a bit lighter overall, leading it to have the lowest twist weight on the list. Feel free to pause the screen here to take a deeper look at the rankings. Now, like I said earlier, the twist weight only really measures horizontal stability, so I did want to talk a bit about the overall reach of the paddles. The J3K, J3K Pro, and R2 are going to be the paddles with the best vertical reach, followed by the Piknix Pro and the J3. Following those are the curved top paddles, the Monarch All Court, Apollo, and the Mach 2 Forza. Finally, the paddles with the least amount of reach are the C8 Zenith and the Movin 16S. Moving on, let's take a look at power. So how much force can be generated onto the ball with a full swing, like an overhead or baseline drive? At the top here, we have the J3K Pro with its tight Kevlar weave and high swing weight. It gives you more power than all the other paddles on this list. Next up is the R2 Pulsar Fx, another high swing weight paddle. And at number 3, we actually have the Monarch All Court. The Monarch has the longest handle on this list at 5.75 inches, which lets you give it that extra torque on drives, and it's got a layer of fiberglass for the added power, putting it at number 3 in this list despite its lower swing weight. At number 4 and 5, we have the J3K, followed by the Spartus Apollo. Number 6 and 7 are the J3 and Piknix Pro. And finally, at number 8, we have the Mach 2 Forza, 9 is the C8 Zenith, and the bottom of the list is the Movin 16S. These rankings are a bit similar to the swing weight rankings here, with the flat top paddles being a bit higher in part due to their higher swing weights, so there is a bit of a correlation. However, there are some outliers like the Apollo and Monarch All Court, placing higher than expected, but this is due to them being a bit more poppy than some of the other paddles. Meanwhile, the J3K, although higher in swing weight, was actually lower on this list in power because it wasn't as poppy. This leads us into the final category we're going to cover, but first, here's the rankings of power on the screen if you want to pause and take a look. Now onto face stiffness and pop of the paddles. This is going to be a measurement on how long the ball stays on the paddle face during contact, with a higher pop value equating to lower dwell time, and a lower pop equating to a more plush feel and longer dwell time. At number 1, we have the J3K Pro again, with its tight Kevlar weave. Number 2 this time is actually going to be the Monarch All Court, which gets its extra pop from the fiberglass layer it has between the carbon fiber sheets. Number 3 is going to be the Ronbus R2 Pulsar Fx, followed by the full Kevlar paddle, the Apollo, at number 4. The 5th spot goes to the Piknix Pro, followed by the Movin 16S at number 6, and then the Sword and Shield J3 at number 7. Just under the J3 is the C8 Zenith at number 8, then the J3K at number 9, and the most plush paddle on this list is the Mach 2 Forza. Now, unlike some of the other metrics, face stiffness is more random here and not affected by other factors such as shape and swing weight, but more from the materials used in the surface and core. But here's the list again for you to pause and take a look at. Now, one category I'm going to glance over is spin. It's a metric I don't really dig into too much detail on this channel. I personally think that the spin of all these Gen 2 paddles will feel similar, and the vast majority of people won't be able to tell RPM differences apart without specialized tools. While RPM differences do exist between these paddles, there's also a variance that's subject to what grit level you receive, as well as the human element in testing, and I find the RPM differences between the paddles to not be a significant amount. Because of that, I personally don't think you should use RPM differences to help you decide on a paddle, but should instead focus on the other categories in this list instead. However, if RPMs are important to you, I'd recommend taking a look at databases from people like Chris Olsen, Pickleball Effect, and John Q, as they've done extensive testing on this. One thing I do want to mention that is pretty important is the existence of paddle variance. Almost all paddles, even ones from the same model and factory, are going to vary a bit because of how they come from the factory. For example, the amount of glue being used in construction can cause a weight variance, which can affect characteristics like the balance point, twist weight, and swing weight, which in turn affects overall power and sweet spot between the paddles. This variance is present in almost every brand, which is why you'll see brands list values like weight, swing weight, and twist weight in a range rather than a singular number. Because of this, I do want to call out that all my numbers and rankings above have only been done with me testing just a single paddle for each brand and model. Unfortunately, this is just the nature of these reviews. Oftentimes, we only get a single paddle to review, which doesn't make our results statistically significant. These results may be different for another reviewer or player, and because of that variance, so people may have different experiences with them. I don't want you all to see these rankings as a source of truth, but instead more of a guideline that's meant to help you in figuring out the ballpark area where these paddles relate to one another. What I do recommend is checking out other reviews of these paddles as well, so you can get a larger sample size and be able to calculate the average values and placement of each paddle. Now that we have that out of the way, I do want to take a look at the rankings I've done so far and to give out my own opinions on what I think will help people make the decision for each paddle. For people that want more of a controlled play style, I would recommend the J3K, Mach 2 Forza, Movement 16S, and the C8 Zenith. The Movement 16S is the quickest paddle on this list with decent control, though this is a paddle I do recommend adding lead tape to in order to increase the sweet spot and power a bit. The J3K has one of the softest feels on this list with the longest reach, but it's also a bit slow to swing. For a soft feel and quicker swing, I would recommend the Mach 2 Forza instead. While you do lose out on some reach, you do make up for it with some more speed and control. The C8 Zenith is the control option if you like a faster paddle in the standard shape. For paddles that classify as a bit more aggressive, these are going to be the J3K Pro, R2 Pulsar Fx, and the Monarch All Court. The J3K Pro tops the list for both power and pop and is the choice for the most powerful paddle on this list. Now the R2 Pulsar Fx plays pretty similarly, but I think it's just a tad underneath in both categories. However, both paddles are a bit on the heavier side to swing, so if you do want an aggressive paddle that's quicker to swing, that's going to be the Monarch All Court. As for paddles that I classify as in between, these would be the Apollo, J3, and the Piknix Pro. Of the three, I think the Apollo leans a bit more towards being on the aggressive end on the list, but the other three paddles I mentioned earlier just outperform it a bit for firepower. However, it's still a fantastic paddle with one of the best sweet spots. The Piknix Pro lies more in the middle of this list for firepower, and it's the only paddle on the list with a short under 5-inch handle. If you don't have a two-handed backhand and don't need the extra handle length, this is definitely a great option to consider because you do get a bit more sweet spot and stability from the added paddle face. And finally, the J3 is the paddle that I consider overall in the middle of this list. It's average for everything for all the measurements and a solid paddle overall. Like I mentioned earlier, these are just my personal opinions on these paddles based on my extensive playtesting with them. I hope these rankings can be of use to you as you all try to decide between the growing option of widebody paddles on the market. I've added links and discount codes in the video description below if you are interested in picking any of these paddles up. Also, I do have my own paddle database that I will be releasing hopefully very soon, where you can see all the stats I've compiled on the paddles I've tested on this channel, so stay tuned for that.
That one. 871.